Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and we are back in Vault 11 today to continue our look at the psychology of the vault. So, kind of looking at the way the experiments impacted human behaviour and kind of trying to look at possible explanations for why these vault experiments had the outcome that they did. So, last time we were discussing the Milgram experiments where basically he was looking at people doing unconscionable things when they're instructed to do so by somebody with authority, and that actually the majority of people would keep doing things even knowing that they were causing harm because someone with authority told them to do so. I say the kind of goal of that experiment was to kind of evaluate why certain people in the 1930s Germany did what they did, and whether they could justify what they did by saying that they were just following orders. Although that finding, I think, is absolutely debatable, but I think one thing that it did show is that people often think better of other people than what might be the reality. So people generally expect the majority of people to do the right thing and to refuse to do something horrible when ordered to do so. But that experiment did show that that wasn't always the case, and for a lot of people it definitely wasn't the case. And I think another one that we have to look at, which we're going to talk about today, is the Stanford prison experiment, and that's a very famous one, or infamous probably is a better word for it, to investigate the cause of sort of sadistic behaviour from prison guards, and whether it was an inherent trait in people and certain people that caused them to behave that way, or whether the environment played a role. It's the whole nature versus nurture thing, which is a concept where, that some things are inherent and essentially genetic, including certain behaviours, while other behaviours are learned from the environment. So very common kind of aspect of psychology that we need to take into account. So the Stanford prison experiment was run in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo, and 24 male students were chosen at random to be prisoners or guards in a mock prison for 7 to 14 days. So the experiment was planned to last up to 2 weeks. It was entirely kind of voluntary. But the guards, the people that were chosen to be guards, were screened for personalities that might favour brutality, which you could argue skewed the results because you're cherry picking people that are more likely to have the tendencies that you're wanting to look for. But they were given wooden batons and similar clothing to prison guard uniforms, as well as mirrored sunglasses to hide their eyes. So there's all kind of things that can make them a bit more anonymous in that sense. And the prisoners were arrested and went through processing before being taken to the prison. It was a very realistic simulation, so they went through the whole thing of being arrested, taken to the police station, having their photos taken, their mugshots and their fingerprints and all that kind of stuff, and being searched and then taken to the makeshift prison. They were given uncomfortable smocks and stocking caps, and a chain was fitted around one ankle. So again, all very realistic. And the guards would refer to these prisoners by their numbers rather than their names. So all these things are essentially there to dehumanise these people. It's like you're not human enough to deserve being called by your name, so we're just going to call you by your number, that kind of thing. So it's making these people feel less than, human. And that's kind of the point here. And it didn't take long for problems to develop. So by the second day, the prisoners were refusing to leave their cells. They ripped off their number tags and started throwing insults at the guards. So the guards responded by spraying them with fire extinguishers, removing their clothes and mattresses, and put the instigators in the special detention unit, so like kind of solitary confinement essentially. They used all sorts of things to keep order, including rewarding those who behaved with food, clothing, and beds. And they made them do push-ups, restricted bathroom access, forced them to use a bucket in their cells. So it's a real combination of both physical punishments and humiliation as a form of punishment and control as well, making them do these extremely humiliating things. It's all very horrible, and there's certainly debate about whether actual criminals should be treated in that way, never mind people that have volunteered for an experiment like this. Whether it's okay to treat them that way. You could certainly kind of debate that, and I don't think it is a simple answer, but bear in mind that this is an experiment, and it's very interesting to see. So when we got to day 3, that was the day that the first prisoner left the experiment. A man named Douglas Corpy. He had a full-blown mental breakdown and he was allowed to leave. He did later state that he faked it because he wanted to study for an exam, and he had assumed that he would be allowed to study for his exam while he was imprisoned. Because obviously, remember, this is a simulation, it's an experiment. These prisoners had not actually done anything wrong, and it was entirely voluntary. So the truth is unclear whether he just said that to save face, because he was embarrassed about getting stressed out by these situations. We don't really know, but perhaps it just kind of occurred to him, like, I don't have to stay here and put up with this because this is a voluntary thing, I'm not an actual criminal. So he just decided to make it so that he would be allowed to leave. And then on day 5, the prisoners, they were allowed visitors from, family and loved ones on the 5th day, but they were forced to wait a long time for 10 minutes of supervised visitation. And some of the parents were quite concerned about their sons and the state that they were in. And then a woman named Christina Maslach, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. She is the girlfriend of Professor Zimbardo, the professor behind this experiment. She also visited on day 5, and she was horrified by the abuse directed towards the prisoners. She believed that even Zimbardo, her boyfriend, was showing concerning changes because he had taken on the role of superintendent and he was allowing the abuse to continue. So it was supervised and he was letting this happen. And she did push him to say, like, we need to pull the plug on this experiment. This is getting into dangerous territory. And that did happen the next day on day 6. So it didn't even last the kind of 7 days that they were hoping for. And it only took 1 day for things to start to devolve into, horrible abuse and treating these people in such a horrible way. And it does seem likely that situation came about. There was encouragement from the researchers that played a role in what happened there, that like in the Milgram experiments, putting people into these situations, it can change behaviour in surprising ways, but it does seem like Zimbardo was encouraging them to do these horrible things to the prisoners, and he was potentially kind of encouraging them and maybe hinting that they should do these things, which is definitely something that could be skewing the results, because these people, the guards, maybe weren't doing all of this completely of their own accord. But the big thing about this particular experiment that I think we should keep in mind is that this has a lot of danger for the participants, because it's inflicting psychological harm on people for the sake of science. Because the prisoners, they were humiliated, they were abused, they were put through some pretty horrible things, and that could leave scars both physically and psychologically. And even the students that played the role of guards could be impacted by that, because they could, maybe get caught up in the swing of things and get caught up in the moment while they were in that situation, but afterwards, potentially feeling guilty and, feeling ashamed of their behaviour after the fact, that kind of thing. So because of this, when you're doing human studies of this kind of nature, there's a lot of control put in place, ethics committees and things to make sure that we're not actually doing harm to people. And there's always a post-experimental debriefing just to ensure that no psychological harm has been done to any of these test subjects. And it's one of these things, it's quite an infamous experiment because of what happened. And the problem is that looking at the results of that, there's really not a lot of conclusions that we can come to, because it wasn't really a very well controlled study in that sense that, there is evidence that those who were chosen to be guards were kind of screened for perhaps having a tendency to show that kind of behaviour, which means that they would be more likely to be like that to these prisoners. Whereas if it was truly random, then you're going to get more information about how likely it is that someone could be changed to behave like that because of the situation that they're in. But if you're choosing people that are more likely to do that anyway, obviously they're more likely to behave that way because that's what you've chosen them for. And the fact that the professor in charge, he wasn't just supervising the experiment, he was participating and he was potentially nudging things a certain way, which then means that the results don't really have as much reliability. But I do think it's kind of interesting to take that into context with the events of Vault 11, particularly with Roy Gottlieb. So he was the leader of the biggest voting bloc, the Justice Bloc. And he was the one that basically coerced Kate Stone into doing sexual favours for him in exchange for him not nominating her husband to be the next overseer and to be the next one to die. So he was using his power and influence for his own ends. He basically, because he was in charge of the largest voting bloc, that puts a lot of power in this man's hands to change things, because the vault was operating in this kind of weird democratic system. But having one voting bloc that's larger, which means that they're all going to vote the same way, essentially, it means that he gets a lot of say in what happens, and that can be a problem. And that meant that for Nate Stone, if they elected him as the next overseer, then that was a death sentence. So that was kind of the thing. And then Kate agreed because she wanted to save her husband's life, and they went and nominated him anyway. So understandably, she was pretty angry about that. And it is this group that are taking advantage of their position of power to get what they want, and then not even sticking to their agreements, because they've obviously think, well, if we nominate him, it's not like she can do anything about that. So they were complacent enough to assume that if they got what they wanted from her, and then they nominated her husband anyway, that she couldn't do anything about that. But props to Catherine Stone. She didn't take it lying down, and she basically went on a little bit of a murder spree. But she allowed herself to be caught, and we know that it's confirmed here in the security terminal. It does confirm that she knew she was going to get caught, essentially. And yeah, so it was if she did the sexual favours, and then and it was all of them as well, so all the leaders of that block. So it wasn't just this one man, there was several of them that were doing it, and she just felt like she didn't really have any other choice, and they could freely abuse their power, essentially. But then when they nominated them anyway, that's when she decided to kill some of them, and she thought that maybe someone else might get elected. But I expected to be caught, that was my best chance, and now they'll elect me. So she knew how to game the system and said, well, if this is what they're going to do, I'm going to make sure that I'm the one that gets elected, so that she could change things. and she was pretty certain that that's what was going to happen, that she would be the one chosen because they have to live with their reasons. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. She was elected overseer, and that's when she made her move and changed the process so it wasn't democratic anymore and it was an RNG. That would mean that it was completely fair. So, it was certainly a smart move on her part. And that's the thing here, is that one of the other big factors, and we're going to talk about another experiment, thankfully one that's a bit less brutal, where we're going to talk about conformity. So that's one of the big things in this vault, is that, at the beginning they were told you have to choose somebody to sacrifice their life every year or everybody is going to die, and you don't have any choice, basically. So it does make the residents here feel like they didn't have a choice, because if they refused, then everybody was going to die. Obviously, we know that was kind of the point of the whole thing, but they didn't feel like they had any choice, so they had to choose a way of doing it that was going to create the least amount of kind of guilt and difficulty in handling this situation. And nobody really wanted to kind of come along and say, maybe we should say no, okay, we might die, but, nobody kind of came along and said that. And that's one of the things with conformity. So following the crowd, it's a very interesting concept. And a lot of people like to think that they're non-conformists, they're not sheep who follow the crowd. But is that really true? Because human behaviour says it's not. Most people do feel safer following the crowd. Society that we live in has a whole list of social norms. So this is a range of behaviours that are considered acceptable, unspoken or unwritten rules and expectations. So when someone doesn't follow those, they are seen as outcasts and they're treated differently. And what is considered normal in society does shift and change as time goes on. It's different in different countries. So things like, I know there's been a bit of chat about tipping culture, because in the United States, tipping is a huge thing and it's basically essential to a lot of people in the hospitality industries, that they get tips because that's how they make enough money to live off and that kind of thing. And that does kind of push towards good customer service, because if you give good customer service, you're going to get tips. Whereas if you don't treat your customers well, then you're not going to get tips and you're not going to make enough money. So tipping culture is very much ingrained in society in the United States. But if you go to somewhere like Japan and you leave a tip in a restaurant, they'll chase you down the street to give you the money back, because it's not something that's done there. So there's cultural differences, that tipping in restaurants and bars and things is very, very different in different parts of the world. But generally speaking, in society, there are these behaviours that are expected and there's these behaviours that are considered unacceptable. And people that don't fit into that are treated differently. And I'm sure many neurodivergent people are very familiar with this, because one of the hallmarks, especially of autism, is that social cues and things can be missed. Autistic people don't always pick up on these or understand them. Things like making eye contact, that kind of thing. And neurodivergent people often have behaviours that are sort of seem weird to neurotypical people, essentially. So, stimming behaviours and things that they do to regulate their nervous system, black and white thinking, all these kinds of things. I say it's a very complex subject that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, but just to say that there are people who struggle to understand these societal norms. They don't have an awareness of them. They don't necessarily learn it the same way neurotypical people do, and often the only way they do is by imitating what other people do and essentially having to tell themselves to make eye contact when talking to somebody and all that kind of thing. But it's better now than it was. There's a better understanding of neurodivergence, autism, and ADHD and things, but we've still got a long way to go. But it's not easy to stand out from the crowd. It's not easy to be the one that everybody's looking at. And that brings me to a very interesting study that was done. This is actually older than the ones we've talked about. So this was carried out by a psychologist called Solomon Asch in 1956, and they basically got students to participate in a group task. So all but one of the group participants were actors, and the real participant was the subject whose behaviour was being studied. Don't worry, this experiment is safe and totally harmless, but I think the results are very interesting. So they were put in a room with the subject and 7 actors, so 8 people. And all the 8 people were shown a card with a line on it, and then another one that had 3 lines labelled A, B and C. They were asked to say aloud which line matched the line on the first card. All the actors were told to give the same incorrect answer, and then the subject would be the last person asked to respond. So would they follow the crowd even when everybody else was clearly wrong? No, 75% of them gave an incorrect answer to at least one of those questions. Which I think is very interesting, because even if you can see clearly C is the answer but everybody else is saying B, it puts that doubt in your mind, like they all think it's B, am I wrong? And there is that fear of kind of standing up and saying, no, you're all wrong, it's this. So very, very interesting that 75% followed the crowd instead of going with what they knew was the correct answer. But interestingly, that percentage dropped if the subject had an ally, meaning that one of the actors was given the correct answer. They would feel more confident in giving the correct answer themselves, and that effect increased with the number of allies. So if there was 2 or 3 actors saying the correct answer, then the subjects were far, far more likely to give the correct answer as well. But when they were the only one and everybody else was given the wrong answer, they were very reluctant to disagree with the group, even when it was actually obvious that the answer was wrong, because it would make them feel awkward. It would make them stand out from the group. So all of this is telling us that people are more willing to obey orders if it comes from someone that they deem important enough. It also tells us that people will be affected by their environment and situation far more than they think they will. And people that are given authority and power can and will come to abuse it if they can get away with it. Not everyone will do that, we know that, but there are people that will. And also that people are far more willing to conform with the group than they think they are for fear of embarrassment. So this really gives us a lot of insight into how everything happened here in this vault and the way everything went down. Because nobody wanted to be the one to stand up and say, this is ridiculous, enough is enough. Because they didn't want to be the one to cause everybody to die by refusing to send one person to their death every year. Nobody wanted to be the one to say that because they were scared. Understandable. And eventually, Catherine Stone got angry enough to change things. She dissolved the election system, and everyone else kind of seemed to forget that before being sent to your death, you still had a term as overseer, which meant that you had the ability to change things because you had that authority. So she obviously made it so that the overseer would be chosen at random using a random number generator. And because of this, Roy and the surviving Justice Bloc members staged a coup, civil war broke out, and it was pure chaos until there was only 5 people left. That brings us back to what happened here. So at this point, there's 5 people left alive. Everybody else is dead because of the fighting. So they've already been pretty much wiped out. So at this point they finally... Could you stop pushing me, please? Stupid bugs. So at this point they decided that enough's enough. We're not doing it anymore. So you can find that recording right at the entrance of the last moments of the last one standing. That they were ashamed of their behaviour. The fact that nobody took a stand and said no until almost everyone was dead They agreed to a suicide pact, although one of them protested that, so there's 4 skeletons. They might have got moved around by the mantises, and a gun. So 4 of them agreed to the suicide pact, and then 1 person left the vault, never to be seen again. We don't know what happened after that. So I'll play the recording in case you haven't heard it before.
Are we really gonna do this? It's open. We could just leave.
I couldn't. Not after that.
We don't deserve to leave. A shining example. That's what it called us. But we were. We did what we were supposed to. Not by a long shot. Anybody would have done what we did.
You ask me? That's exactly the problem. Now let's get on with this.
I'll go first. Wait. People should know what happened. They could learn from it. If there's anyone out there at all, I hope they never have to find out. Ready, Harry? Yeah. No, wait!
There we go. So, yeah, they couldn't live with everything that they'd done once they found out the truth about the vault, which of course is that when they said, no, we're not sending anyone else to die, the vault's like, congratulations on being the shining example to humanity for refusing to kill your fellow man. You can now leave the vault if your overseer says it's safe to do so. Which is just the final nail in the coffin for these people. They don't even want people to find out what happened, and the fact that anyone would have done what we did. And she says, if you ask me, that's exactly the problem. And that is the thing, is that this outcome, it seemed inevitable that this is what was going to happen and this is how it was going to play out because of human nature. And, you know, you've got these conflicting things between, you know, that need for survival, because living things want to survive. That's literally our entire nervous system. Our bodies are designed to survive and reproduce. That, you know, biologically speaking, that is the basis of all life. So survival instincts tend to be very, very strong, and that means that people are not going to want to risk themselves dying and everyone around them dying. You know, it just really shows us that, you know, people didn't want to be the one to say no. So coming back to that collective punishment, because they didn't want to be responsible for everybody getting killed. Milgram's experiments did show us that people often assume better of people than what really happens, and also that people were willing to inflict harm on others even when they felt uncomfortable about it if an authority figure told them to do it. And that, you know, people being given authority and power over others, people are more likely to obey those orders, but also that people that have that authority and have that control, for some people certainly there is a tendency to abuse that because they feel like they can. Which comes back to the Stanford prison experiment. And then the conformity, that nobody really wanted to go against the grain and question what they were doing, even if they were in their heads thinking, this seems really extreme, I don't think this is right, but they were scared to kind of say that out loud and to bring up the idea of refusing to do what the vault told them to do. But because of that, the system here devolved into horrendous corruption. People were taking advantage of their situation. They were taking advantage of the position of power that they had. So Roy Gottlieb and his friends had a lot of power to choose who died next, and they abused it for sexual gratification because they could get away with it. And then that fear of this collective punishment, the survival instincts, and creating a situation where people had to make a choice. They're going to pick whoever they feel the least bad about losing, and that's what Catherine Stone figured out, and she used that to her advantage in a way. And she kind of broke the system. And people can rationalise all kinds of horrible things in the name of survival, and that's a theme that we do see very regularly in the Fallout universe, and it manifests in many different ways. And you've got this election campaign, and again, if you first come into this vault, you're seeing these posters, like, Haley is a known adulterer and communist sympathiser, so elect Haley for overseer. And you think, why would you want, if somebody's that bad, why would you want to elect them? And it just makes no sense until you find out the truth, and then you think, oh God, it's an election that nobody wants to win. You can read the campaign manifestos on the computers where people are basically saying, please don't elect me because I have too much to live for. Like Henry Glover has 6 children, and the youngest said Dada as his first word. He wants Nathan Stone to be elected. Donna Haley says that she's the victim of a smear campaign and is unqualified. Nathan Stone says he thinks the whole thing is ridiculous and everybody should be ashamed. And Catherine Stone said basically that she knew that getting caught for murder meant that she would get elected, but somebody else does say if they can find the murderer, they've got to promise a new candidate for overseer. So we kind of know that was the thinking, and that's what she used to her advantage. And it's such a twisted dystopian story, and it's not the only one that I know of. There's one that comes to mind in the Hunger Games lore, which I think is very interesting and is worth mentioning. So for anyone that doesn't really know, the country of Panem is essentially what's left of North America after a bunch of natural disasters and nuclear war. So the capital is based in the Rockies, and the rest of the nation is divided into 13 districts. Each one has its own industry. And most people in districts live in abject poverty, especially in 12, which is located in Appalachia and is the coal mining district. So because the districts rebelled against the capital, which is basically where all the rich people live, the capital decided that each year the 12 surviving districts, because 13 was obliterated in the war essentially, would give a boy and a girl aged between 12 and 18 to participate in the Hunger Games, where they were put into an arena and they were forced to fight to the death, with one lone survivor being named the victor. It was all televised and required watching in the districts, and it became more and more of a spectacle, so that 75 years into the Hunger Games, each tribute had their own stylist, and they were dressed up and there was a parade, and they were fed these really rich, like, 4-course meals, and they were pampered. And then it became a whole thing. And then every 25 years they would host what was called a quarter quell, which almost certainly was President Snow's idea, and that was a special games with some new twist would be added to make it more interesting for the capital. So the 75th Games, which is featured in Catching Fire, if you've read the books or seen the movies, and what they did was that all the tributes were chosen from existing victors, which means that they went from age 17 being Katniss and Peeta to in their 80s with Mags, which was pretty horrendous. And a lot of the people in the capital weren't happy about it because they liked their victors. They were celebrities, so they weren't happy. And then if we look at the 50th Games, which is featured in Sunrise on the Reaping, which is the newest book that talks about games that Hamish Abernathy won, they had double the amount of kids, so there was 48 instead of 24. And if you've read that book, it's no wonder that Hamish was drunk all the time. I don't blame him at all now that I know what he went through. The movie for that's coming out in November this year. It's going to be awesome, but also terrible. But yeah, so 48 kids and 1 survivor, absolutely horrendous. And then the 25th Games, which aren't featured in the books but they are mentioned, so we do know that what happened was that each district had to elect their male and female tributes. They were forced to hold an election to choose which kids went off to probably die. Can you imagine that? They were forced by this oppressive authoritarian regime to choose 2 kids to go off to the arena where they're probably going to die because only one can survive. How do you choose? How do you make that decision? Like, how could you live with your choice, especially if the kid dies, which is more likely than not? How would you feel if all your neighbours voted for your child to go to their death? But with enough fear and enough power, it is possible to make people do unspeakable things. I'm not sure if Vault-Tec expected the outcome that they got in Vault 11, but unfortunately, as dark and horrible as the story of this place is, it's not that unrealistic. Um, Unfortunately, and we know that from just patterns of human behaviour, and certainly most of the experiments that I mentioned in this video and the previous video are flawed in many, many ways, except for the one with the cars on the lines. I think that was a fairly straightforward experiment, and the results, you can make a reasonable interpretation of them, but the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiments were horrendous in their execution, and they certainly weren't you do have to be cautious with interpreting the results because of the method that was chosen for kind of how to set the experiment up. But the scientific process, we're always learning new information, and the way studies operate, there is a process, and you can never completely draw a single conclusion from just one study. You would have to look at multiple studies, multiple different methodologies before you can make any specific conclusions. And even then, things can change. New information can new information can come to light. New studies can show that maybe things weren't quite as clear cut as we first thought. It's the way science goes. And you do have to look at the kind of the method and look at potential biases and potentially things that might skew the results one way or another. So something to hit his gun. That's what he's talking about.
Nothing here.
Yep, nothing there. So you do have to take some of these conclusions with a grain of salt, and certainly these experiments in the 60s and 70s had a lot of flaws and potential to do harm to the test subjects, especially the Stanford prison experiment. That one really could have done a lot of harm to those men that took part in it because of the way they were treated. And I say it does seem like maybe the person in charge of the experiment was kind of pushing things a certain way, which kind of means that he's kind of pushing things to manipulate them into getting the result he's looking for, rather than, just kind of setting up the experiment and making note of what happens. So I think that's something to bear in mind. But, Vault 11 was a tragedy. Everything that happened in that vault is horrible. It's a really dark story, but unfortunately, it's not unrealistic. It's not unrealistic, and it seems likely that if something like that was to happen in real life, the outcome would be probably the same as what happened here. It really would be, and that's a tragedy in itself. I think as a species, humans, we've evolved a lot, and we've changed a lot in terms of what we've created and what we've made in the world, and we are in danger of potentially losing our humanity to some degree. I think that's something that's quite evident in various things happening in the world right now. And having a bit more empathy for our fellow man is definitely never going to be a bad thing, in my opinion. But, humans are going to human, and there's only so much that one person could do to change that. But I think this story, and looking at the kind of psychology and the thinking, that a lot of it is fear-based control, as people feared, dying. Understandably, the majority of people do fear that. And being the one that people chose to die, because if everybody decides to choose you as the next person to die, it's not going to feel good. Whatever their reasons for choosing you over other people, it's not going to feel good. And as soon as Catherine Stone decided to take away the power for people to choose who got to be sacrificed, they weren't happy about it. They liked having that choice, and then civil war broke out in the vault, and most people ended up dead anyway. So it's a real quiet tragedy, but I think it's something that we could all pay more attention to, so that we don't completely lose ourselves, and what makes humanity what it is. So let me know your thoughts. It's obviously quite a big subject. We've got a few experiments to talk about. The other videos won't be quite as in depth, but Vault 11, there's a lot goes into the story there. And I think it's very interesting to talk about. Next week we're gonna visit Vault 19, so we're staying in New Vegas for that. And we're going to talk about some mental health disorders and induced paranoia and that kind of thing. So hopefully you'll join me for that. As always, love to hear your thoughts on things. Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye.